Okay, so I guess we'll jump into it unless, Holly, did you want to introduce yourself for any folks who might not know?
Hi, I'm Holly, and I'm a dog trainer. Today, I'll be answering your questions about separation anxiety and also maybe other stuff if you want to get off topic. We'll find out.
Perfect. Okay, so I thought we would talk about, there was some people that have dogs and then a lot of people that had puppies. So I think everyone's kind of starting from different levels of, like obviously some puppies have never been alone, and then some adult dogs are used to being alone, but after this whole thing are not as used to it anymore. Sorry, I'm just gonna admit this next person. So I think we should just start by talking about kind of the signs and things to look for if your puppy or dog is developing separation anxiety. So could you name a few of those kind of telltale signs?
Yeah, so this will kind of vary depending on, separation anxiety is a spectrum, basically, where you don't just have separation anxiety, you can have different levels of it. So you can have a dog with mild, moderate, severe, super severe separation anxiety, and what all of those things will look like will be different. So classic signs, if you have moderate or severe separation anxiety, chances are you probably already know, because it's really hard to, come back to half a door and be like, I wonder what happened. So with mild separation anxiety, which is what a lot of people end up missing, you'll usually start with things such as incessant or long periods of intermittent barking. You may see things like your puppy won't be eating food while you're gone, so you'll come back home and they'll suddenly start playing with a toy that you left them that was filled with food, for example, and you're like, oh, I was gone for 6 hours and you didn't eat any of that, and now that I'm home, you're eating that. You'll also sometimes see that your dog will begin scratching things. They may, if you have a camera and you can watch your dog, you'll often see that they become really lethargic. They become kind of depressed almost, or all they do is they'll just lay down and either stare, usually at your entry and exit point. So if your front door or your garage door, for example, you'll often see that dogs with separation anxiety will just stare for hours. So if you've got a camera, you'll see a lot of usually you'll see kind of either a complete reduction in behavior, where your dog shuts down, or what's called stresses down, where they shut down, they don't eat, they don't drink, they don't move, things like that. Or you'll see the opposite, where they stress up and they bark, they howl, they cry, they defecate, they destroy things, stuff like that. And usually you'll see one or the other. Often you'll see a little bit of a mix depending on who your individual dog is. But one of the most difficult parts about separation anxiety is that this is an incredibly individualized disorder, basically, where it'll always look a little different from case to case.
Yeah, definitely. And Gemma was asking whether you recommend cameras where you can talk to and treat your dogs. So you're kind of watching them to see how they're doing. Do you recommend kind of interacting with them from afar?
I absolutely love two-way cameras and treat tossing cameras for preventing separation anxiety and also for treating mild separation anxiety. Once you get past this threshold, you really want to be looking at booking with a specialist. Most trainers would be able to walk you through prevention and mild, but by the time you get to things like moderate and severe, oftentimes cameras don't do a whole lot for those dogs other than just kind of give you a way to watch your dog suffer, which isn't super fun.
Yes, no, it doesn't sound very fun at all. Okay, so I think everyone is kind of leaving their dog for like maybe an hour or two right now to go to the grocery store, things like that. Would you say that that amount of time is enough to kind of have them be used to being left alone?
So you cut out for a second, Hannah, but if I heard you quite right, I think you said that people are practicing leaving their dogs for like an hour or two whenever they go to the grocery store, do essential shopping, stuff like that. And people are wondering if that's enough. Is that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
So this is one of those super fun behavior answers you'll hear all the time, which is it depends. Because what it depends on is what your ultimate goal is. Because when you go back to normal life and go back to your schedule, whatever that looks like, if you are working part-time and you're expecting that your dog needs to learn how to be alone for 3 or 4 hours a day before someone comes home and exists in the same house as the dog, then 1 to 2 hours is probably enough prep time. This also depends on whether or not your dog has separation anxiety or has had it before, is anxious, how old they are. There's a lot of factors that will go into this. So the good news is that getting them to be alone for 1 to 2 hours at a time is good. The question is it enough? So if you are, for example, working long hours, like if you're in the medical field and you work routinely 12 or 14-hour shifts, 1 to 2 hours is definitely not going to be enough, because you're seeing such a huge gap between what you have the time to prep them for versus what they're actually going to experience. So this is where things can become very situational. So you really want to look at what your expectations are ultimately for your dog and try to prep them for, I would say at the very, very least, half the amount of time that you plan to leave them alone. I would say that's your absolute minimum. The closer you can get to working them up to the full amount, while you still have the luxury of being at home and being able to like run away whenever you feel like it, even if it just means sitting outside in your backyard and avoiding your dog. That's really what you want to be doing, is trying to set your dog up slowly but surely to get used to the idea of you leaving again.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Jessica has a good question, which I think all the puppy owners will probably have. Fox and I haven't been apart even once. How do we begin at the basics? So how do you just leave incremental amounts? Yes, most likely. Take it
So
away.
are correct. What you want to do is, if you guys, for all the puppy owners in here or new dog owners, you want to be making sure that, especially for puppy owners, dogs under 1 or so, or we have any potty training or destruction concerns, you need to make sure before you start any of the separation anxiety training that your dog has confinement skills. So learning how to be confined and learning how to be alone are 2 separate skills that are basically 2 sides of the same coin. You need to teach your puppy how to be confined first, before you can teach them how to be alone, because otherwise you're trying to learn 2 things at once, and that's double the work, and your puppy's a baby. They tire out pretty quick and they're not going to be able to learn that much that quickly. So to answer your question, the very first thing you should do is make sure your puppy can stay in a crate, or stay confined either in a crate or a pen and crate or a pen, whatever floats your boat for what you guys are doing. Once you've done that, then you want to start by just getting your puppy used to the idea that you being in the room with them does not mean that you're going to be paying attention to them. So put them in their crate, in their pen, and just ignore your dog for a little bit. Of course, you do still want to be paying attention to your dog. There is the myth out there that you shouldn't reward your dog or love them or pay attention, because that's going to make it worse. That is, generally speaking, not true. Because what's happening is, during separation anxiety, is you're encountering a panic attack, basically. So you really want to make sure that while you're with your puppy and you have the time to be with them, you're really truly with them, love them, play with them, hang out with them, all that fun stuff. Make sure that their needs, their emotional needs, are met before you practice. Because a puppy who's been alone for a couple hours and is bored and is like, I want to hang out with you, that is not the right time to try and practice separation and alone time. But right after you've been with them for like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you've snuggled, you've played, you've done all that stuff, when they're like, I feel relaxed and content inside, that is the perfect time to practice separation anxiety training. Because when you walk away, your puppy's like, well, I just spent the last, 30 minutes with you. Bye. I don't care. See you later. I'm tired. And that's really where you want to be starting with a puppy.
Okay, great. So when you're leaving, so you would start with confinement training, getting them used to the crate and comfortable in the crate, or pen, whichever. And then would you just walk out of the room and come back and kind of reward them, or how would you build up that kind of like capacity to be alone?
It the good old "it depends" comes back, because if you have 2 people or more people in the home versus 1 person, how you do things changes. Whether or not you have a tree tossing camera, for example, will also change things. The general rule of thumb is, what you need to teach your puppy is that you walking either away, out of sight, out the front door, whatever level you're at, is not a reason for them to panic or worry. So what you really want to try and do is instill with them the idea that you walking either out of sight, or they can hear the door close, or whatever your leaving sequence usually looks like, means good things are about to happen. So if you have a partner that can help you, what you can do is have 1 person practice leaving and the other person play treat machine, where as soon as 1 person walks away from the person, away from your dog, you begin rewarding them. So your puppy associates that you walking away, means food. Same thing happens when you escalate from just walking away to walking out of view. And you go from walking away to walking out of view to walking through the front door and then back again. And what happens is everything wonderful and nice happens when your puppy is watching you leave or progressively get further away from them. And then once you come back, all the fun stuff stops. And what you get eventually is a puppy who's like, well, that was, when you leave, good things happen. When you come back, all the fun stuff stops. Go away, get out of here, leave. Like, let me have my treat party. And you're teaching your dog that they're looking forward to some alone time as well. So this is all great places where you can start with mild separation anxiety, but that's a lot of where I would start. If you have a treat camera, then you can use just one person, because now you just open up the app on your phone or whatever you have. And then as you begin walking away, you start tossing treats. When you walk around the corner out of sight, you toss treats. You can just stand there at your front door. If your puppy can't see you, open it, and then drop it closed, and then toss treats. And you can do things like that. Is that all making sense to you guys?
Makes sense to me. I see a couple nods. Okay, I have 3 good questions to go to. I'm going to start with Eve's just because it rolls in well. If your dog is attached to a particular person in the family, should they be the one practicing leaving? And what if your dog is one of the ones that won't eat when someone is going to leave?
So if your dog has what's called a key attachment, or a specific attachment to a single person in the home where they care more basically when that person leaves, it kind of depends on where you're starting. So if you have a dog who's displaying just the teeniest, tiniest bits of what you think might be separation anxiety, you can probably start with that key person. But if you're seeing a more generalized anxiety where when they're alone, they're anxious, when people that are not the key person is home, they're still kind of anxious, but they're coping a lot better, but they really want the key person to be home, then I would probably start with having the key person be there while everyone else that's not the key person practices leaving first. And then once you're kind of getting a hang of that and your dog's doing better, then I would switch, and then I would start with the key person. That way you're not going too fast for them. Really, with separation anxiety, you want to go at your dog's pace. And often that is way slower than we wish it was. Now, if your dog is the type that won't eat when someone leaves, is this a particular person, like a key person, where they'll still eat when other people are around and other people are there, but only when the key person leaves they stop eating? Or is this like a non sequitur, like when nobody's home, I don't eat type deal when everyone leaves? So that right there is a classic sign of separation anxiety. Without seeing it and knowing more details, it is difficult to say, but what I would start doing is pretty much most of the exercises you're going to hear about today. Where you can start practicing leaving your dog alone and teaching them that it's okay. So this means that if you leave, like you walk out the door, for example, and you leave the home, handle that. That when you walk out the door is when they can't, to the point where they're like, I can't eat, I feel sick. So we need to start with things like walking away from them or simply walking out of sight of them. You want to start there. No problem.
Okay, great. Let's move to Gemma's question. She was asking about a crate versus a pen. If a dog is comfortable in both of them, and she seems more comfortable in her crate but more energetic in her pen, would you have like a one that seems better than the other? Are they kind of similar?
They're pretty similar. In respect to comfortable versus energetic, that's a very good observation. So good job, Gemma. I would say with Indy, as your crate and pen set up separate and not together then? Together. If it's together, then honestly, I'd let your puppy free roam in and out of their crate and pen since it's attached. There's nothing wrong with giving them a little extra space. If you're going to leave anything in there, you want to, of course, make sure it's not something they're going to chew up. Like oftentimes with a potty pad, if you leave your puppy alone with a potty pad, you'll come back to potty pad confetti instead, which is not usually what you want. So that's where you want to environmentally manage, of course. But I don't see why you wouldn't want to just leave them in both. That's fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a good question. Jessica was asking, if we're trying to build up to 6 to 8 hours, is it okay to let them work on free roaming, and would that be too long to stay in a crate?
6 to 8 hours is a pretty long period of time to be alone for, especially in a crate. I generally recommend, as a general rule of thumb, for most or the average adult dog, not including puppies, that you don't really want to leave your dog alone for more than 4 to 6 hours at a time. This is both for their physical health, because you don't, if you've ever held your bladder for 8 hours straight, it's not fun. Now do that 5 days a week, and that's not super fun at all. The other reason being that dogs are social animals and they really shouldn't be left alone for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, 5 days a week. It's not healthy for them. Just like it's not healthy for us to be in isolation for hours and hours and hours every 5 days a week, for example. So if you are trying to build up to 6 to 8 hours, Jessica, how old is your dog? 1. Okay. So at 1 year of age, his bladder is developed enough that you theoretically can leave him alone for 6 to 8 hours. And if you're not seeing any destructive concerns, like your puppy is kind of over the age where they're chewing on walls, picking stuff off the counter and destroying it, things like that, then you can work on free roaming. I would say 6 to 8 hours is maybe a little much for a 1 year old dog. I might, at that age brackets, consider investing in like a dog walker or a neighbor or something like that, and then maybe start some of the day, break it in half, basically do some part free roam, some part crated, and find a way to have a care professional or just a nice neighbor or a friend or whatever, or you on your lunch break, come in halfway through so that you break up that separation and you can get them closer to letting them free roam the entire time. But personally, if it was me, I probably wouldn't trust a 1 year old dog to be good for 8 hours straight, 5 days a week.
Segues into her next question, which is great. What is the reasonable maximum you would recommend a dog being alone?
Yes.
So yeah, around 6 hours.
Yeah, somewhere around there. If you need to leave them alone for longer than that, because sometimes real life happens, that's where I recommend a care professional sometimes. Somebody who can come in somewhere around every 4 to 6 hours to hang out with your dog, take them out, let them go to the bathroom, play with them, stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. Natalie, I'm going to come back to your question at the end just because it's a little bit, it's more like a general, or not general, but actually more specific in a different type of anxiety way. But I do have some other questions here. Okay, so if you're at home with your puppy and they seem to be kind of glued to you, following you around, always wanting to touch you, I'm assuming that would probably happen as well when they're leaving. So what would be kind of your first steps to getting them comfortable being alone, even if you're in the same room? If that makes sense.
So this is where I would implement confinement training. So this is where you can, once you've confinement trained your dog, there is some degree of separation with confinement training, which is really in its own way actually just like baby steps of alone time training. Because when your dog is separated from you through a crate or a pen or something like that, they can no longer be that like Velcro smushy dog that's just like, I need to have my body touch your body 24/7. And you've already started that alone time training that way. So that's probably the first place that I would start with something like that. And from there, you're really just working on, if you have a dog that's really clingy and gets upset when they can't touch you, that is oftentimes a sign of anxiety. So you do need to make sure that we are looking a little bit deeper and making sure that we're not just trying to train around a bigger problem at which we maybe need to go and look at the root of that anxiety. Because if your dog is just 24/7 anxious for what seems like no reason, there's a very good chance that we maybe need to talk to our vet about whether or not they think that our dog might have generalized anxiety, which can either be genetic or it can be learned or it can be both. So with a Velcro dog, that's where I would start with also fostering in some being mindful of codependency as well, and doubling down on your patterns and your consistency. Anxious dogs thrive, well, really we all thrive on pattern and routine, but anxious dogs especially need it in a way that non-anxious dogs can cope without it. So you really want to make sure you're looking at extraneous factors if we're seeing something like that. This is where I would also maybe look into booking a private session, because with an anxious dog, you're dealing with more than just separation anxiety usually. It's usually other stuff that you don't know about yet.
Okay. Great. Lots of questions coming in. I can see why we had so much interest in this. I guess it is a very, very complicated kind of thing, having your dog be comfortable alone. So first, an easy one. Transitioning from leaving your dog in a crate to leaving them free roam. Is it the same theory, shorter sets of time, and then building up when there is success?
Yes. Yeah. So what I like to do is I recommend for puppies at least 2 weeks, usually 2 to 4 weeks of no accidents. Accidents can be either destruction accidents or potty accidents before you expand space. So you start with the smallest amount, whatever space you have. You're looking to make sure that your puppy is comfortable, they're doing fine, they're not encountering any accidents. If you can do that and have nothing, no accidents happen for 2 to 4 weeks-ish, then you can expand to the next size up in space availability. And then you can do another 2 to 4 weeks-ish, and then you can do it again and again, and you're slowly pushing your dog's boundaries. Because what you don't want to do is go from a crate and a pen, or just a crate, into you now have 1,000 square feet to roam, because your puppy isn't going, or your dog, if you have a new dog as well, is not going to understand how to appropriately interact with that environment. So when you give them all of that environment, you basically exponentially increase the chance that they're not going to know what they're supposed to do in the house and be like, well, I should go pee. I could hold it for an unknown amount of time. I have no idea when you're coming back. Or I could go to this place in the house that I've never been in that I don't think anyone uses because I've never used it, and I'm going to pee there.
Yeah, definitely. So extending the time and also extending the space.
Yep, both.
Great. Okay, sorry, I'm just picking the next one to do. So this one from Rachel here. Pancake is okay when we leave the house, but is struggling while we are at home in a different room. We have glass walls so he can see us and started kicking the glass. So that sounds like might not be separation, might be like the barrier sort of frustration.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking as well. Based on that description, my guess is that Pancake, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, my guess is that maybe Pancake doesn't know what glass walls are, which is fair. And he's confused and frustrated as to why he can't just walk through the hard air and get to you guys. And that's pretty normal. Dogs, generally speaking, kind of struggle with object permanence. Just like a lot of young babies where they're like, I'm here, I'm here, I'm not here. Dogs are the same, where if you've ever seen a dog who wraps themselves around a leash, their leash around the pole, and then you try to follow them and they follow you, and like endless circle thing that's going on, and your dog's like, I don't understand what's happening. It's because they don't understand what's happening. Impulse control, frustration tolerance, as well as probably some specific exercises to teach them that that hard air is actually a wall and you can't go through it, and that's also okay.
Definitely. Similar question from Heather. How is it best to train a dog to be comfortable in a separate room?
To be comfortable in a separate room, what I often will like to do is I will usually remove myself rather than remove the dog. I find that that's a little bit simpler. Sometimes when you remove a dog to another area, some dogs, especially sensitive or dogs that are sensitive or anxious, anything like that, they often tend to be highly attuned for if something is wrong. So when you put them away, some sensitive dogs will be like, what did I do wrong? Please, I only wanted to just love me, no. And they'll think that they've done something wrong, which is why you've put them away. So when you remove yourself, you usually remove that doubt from them. And then what I often will like to do is I will pair special fun stuff that only happens when you leave them alone. With that time. So you might do something like have a couple frozen stuffed toys in the freezer, and then maybe you go and grab one and you walk out of the room, and just before you close that door, you toss.
Okay, great. Great, thanks. You're welcome, Heather. Jessica asked something that is kind of related to that. Is it true that dogs are the most destructive within the first few minutes of their owners leaving? Is that why interactive toys are helpful at this point, and why you give them when you leave?
Did you say most distracted or most destructive?
Destructive.
Case specific, depends, as per usual. I often find that with interactive toys, what you are doing when you're giving them interactive toys is you're basically giving your dog an activity. So one of the number one underlying issues behind the vast majority of behavioral issues that crop up is lack of stimulation, understimulation, generally speaking, mental stimulation. So for example, if anyone here has had that terrible problem of being on vacation too long, and you start to go a little stir crazy and you get bored and you're like, looking for other stuff to do, or recently you've been in isolation and you've found that your brain is weird now because you're not doing enough stuff and it thinks of weird anxious thoughts for no real reason that back in the real world when you were doing stuff never used to be a problem. Anything along those lines also happen with your dog. So what you're doing when you're giving them things to do is you're keeping their mind busy, basically. And when you keep their mind busy and when you keep their brain busy, you keep the brain and the body from developing its own job or its own task. And what I usually say is that when your dog decides to do their own exercise, whether it be mental or physical, they very, very rarely make good choices. They usually pick bad things to do. So you want to make sure that you're giving them stuff to do so that when they're like, I want to do something, they're like, oh wow, look at this appropriate thing to do right here in front of me. So that's the real reason why you're giving them interactive toys, is to keep them busy and make sure that they're not bored and give them some mental stimulation. And last but not least, of course, also give a little bit of a positive um, sort of association for when you leave, because now they get their fun special toys that they only get when you leave.
Yeah.
Ooh, Hannah, are we there?
Hello,
There we
I'm
go.
here. I heard you talking through mud. It was very interesting. Do you recommend having lots of things to keep their mind busy while they're home alone? Is Jessica's follow-up question.
Things. Yeah, I usually recommend a couple. I like to leave at least one in each category. So a chew toy, a stuffed interactive toy, and then just like a regular squeaky, general ropey type fluffy toy, something along those lines. I find that way, depending on what your dog's in the mood for, they're like, I want to chew on something today. And they're like, oh, look, there's a chew right here. Or maybe 3 hours later after they take a nap and wake up, they're like, I really wish I could eat some food. Oh, look, there's food. And you're kind of hitting all your bases that way so that you can kind of, because you can't like micromanage and predict what your dog's going to want to do. So you can just give them some stuff and then they can choose later.
Yeah, great. Okay, I have 2 more questions on the list from the chat. So anyone who has any final questions, feel free to type it up. So Heather asked, I have a 5-year-old who has anxiety, but was pretty used to being home alone before the pandemic. How gradual should the transition to being apart be? He's left free room.
So we have a dog with anxiety. It's 5 years old, and it was used to being home alone. So we didn't previously have any separation anxiety issues, but now that we're home all the time, we're concerned about separation anxiety when we do start leaving again. Is that right? Okay. So I would probably start with kind of figuring out your boundaries, or more specifically your dog's boundaries, because at this moment in time there is a threshold at which it is cool to leave. Your dog thinks it's cool to be left alone for X amount of time, minutes, seconds, hours, and there's no real way to know what it is. So you kind of got to figure that out. Now, something I will say is the first time you do leave your dog alone, you want to make sure you don't push them to their limits. So I would start by trying to make basically an educated guess based on how well you know your dog. How long do you think you can? Do you think 30 minutes sounds like I can probably do that? Or do you think like an hour sounds like you can probably do that? This is where you kind of need to take some educated guesswork and just kind of start there. And if you're not thinking leaving them alone is appropriate, you can also start super soft by just doing the separated through different rooms in the house exercise, and then get a camera. If you don't want to invest in a camera, you can also use your laptop and your cell phone and just like Skype yourself, for example, and then just point Mr. Camera at the dog so that you can kind of see what's going on without having to invest. And you can start there with separate rooms and then work your way up to walking in and out of the door. It all depends on whereabouts you think is safe to start. But if when you're making your educated guesses, err on the side of caution.
Yeah, and so just to call back to kind of the things that you would want to be looking for that you would know that it was too far, Maybe just like if you could repeat some of the those classic signs that a dog is not having a good time.
When you push your dog too far.
Yeah.
So the most classic one is going to be vocalization. Whining, crying, barking, whimpering. That's really, really common. Other things are jumping, um, either trying to get to you where you're beginning to see your dog is starting to try and get out of their confinement space, whether that be a crate and pen or the room that they're in. Those are all classic signs that your dog's been pushed too far. More subtle signs is when you return home, your dog is overly exuberant. Now, this is a really difficult one because this is very, very context based, because some dogs are just ready to party when you come home and they're like, yeah, you're home, everything's great. But other dogs, and this can be very difficult to tell the difference between the two, aren't ready to party. They're gushing over you because they were depressed, they were panicked, they were worried the entire time. And they were like, oh my gosh, you did come home. I didn't think I was ever gonna see you again. I thought I was gonna die. I don't know what that is, but I'm pretty sure it's bad. Ah, you're home. And they're panicking and they're freaking out. And if you don't have a trained eye, or if you're not looking for it, these two things can look almost exactly the same. And this is where good body language education will really help you tell which one is which. And if you don't want to do that, you can also outsource it by just filming it and then hiring a professional and be like, hey, is this cool? And they can help you figure out those subtle details if you're not sure.
Definitely. Okay, one last question, a bit more related to confinement training, but obviously that's very important to separation anxiety training as well. If we're starting at confinement training, how would you approach a puppy who screams when the crate door is closed? Would you let them cry it out? And would this create fear to the crate?
I would not let them cry it out. And probably it would create fear, because I imagine if I didn't want to be locked in a teeny tiny room that was just big enough for me to lay down in, and then I was like, no, don't leave me in the room, and then my mom left me in the room and walked away, I'd probably be pretty upset. I wouldn't want to be in the room anymore. So once you put yourself in your puppy's perspective, and especially you look at your expectations and age them down to how old your puppy is, it starts to become very obvious. They're like, oh, maybe that's probably not the right choice. That is some very old school advice, which I will say technically usually does work, but the reasons why it works are not particularly nice. They work because your puppy screams and cries and cries and cries and cries until it realizes that no one cares. And then they stop crying because there's no point anymore. And that's really, really sad. And we can definitely teach our dog to not cry in the crate without having to do any of that. So we might as well. And what you want to be doing is you want to be starting before that. So this is where you need to back it up, and we need to look at things like, does your puppy even like their crate? Will they go in their crate at any point in time without you asking them, prompting them, things like that? Because if your puppy never does, then we probably need to start there with just the pure association of our puppy doesn't really like the crate. And we got to start with different kinds of crate training games, things that will build fun, positive associations with that crate. And you want to really ramp those up until your puppy's like, I love my crate. Like, one of my favorite tests is if you give your puppy something to chew on or something to play with that's new, where do they go? If you, especially in a pen, for example, if you have a crate and pen combo, and if you give your puppy something new and they run into their crate and lay down and they're like, yeah, new stuff, I'm going to chew on this, pee on it, whatever, I'm a puppy, then what you see is you're like, yes, my puppy was like, I need somewhere safe to go explore and do stuff with this new thing, and that's my crate. So you know your association is done then, and you're at the maintenance stage where you can start pushing things farther. But if your puppy does not ever go in their crate, unless you ask them to, or find reasons to make them want to go in, like a toss a treat in there or something like that, then we have some association work to do, and you want to start there.
Okay, and if they seem to like the crate, but they just don't like when the door is closed, then that's kind of the thing that you're working on, right?
Ooh, Hannah, my friend, we cut out.
Okay, sorry. If they like the crate, but not when the door is closed, that's what you're working on. It's just the act of closing the door, or is there anything? Do you think there's more to the crate than we're thinking?
It kind of depends on, closing the door to the crate is one of those things where it sounds like it's pretty specific, but it's actually really broad. What does that mean? Are we asking the puppy to go in, and then once the puppy is in? Do we close the door before really quickly before they turn around and they're like, oh no, I've been trapped? Are we having the puppy watch us when we close the door and they're already becoming anxious as the door is closing and we do it anyway? At which point in time we can't close the door. We need to start and wind back to just physically touching the door, where the puppy's in the crate, everything's hunky-dory, we touch the door with 2 fingers and throw a bunch of treats in there. And we're like, yay, I touched the door and you got snacks. And then we touch and move it, and then we do the snacks thing again, and then you work your way close. Or is this, the screaming doesn't start for maybe 5 or 10 seconds, at which point in time we need to close the door and then immediately begin chucking treats in there before we hit that 10-second threshold where our puppy's like, okay, the door is closed, panic time and countdown T-minus 10 seconds, and you've got that window of time to be like, no, we're not gonna do that today. Instead, we're gonna have a fun treat party, yay! And then what you do is delay Mr. Treat Party, you space out treat party, things like that. All to make sure that you're starting with wherever your dog can handle. That's the important part.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, there was that question about car anxiety that it looks like Vivian also would like the answer to, but before we move on to that, does anyone have any wrap-up questions about separation anxiety specifically, or preventing separation anxiety, which is ideally where most people are at?
Okay, hopefully.
Just give you guys some time to type. Okay, and yeah, this will be recorded, and we'll probably have another one soon because, oh, wait, says Natalie, because like what you saw, there's a lot of questions and you can go pretty deep into pretty much all the answers.
Totally.
Okay, Natalie. Oh, a puppy up the top of the stairs that does not go down the stairs.
This is probably not separation anxiety, especially if this is a young puppy under 6 months. This is more likely a fear-related issue where your puppy does not understand how to go up and down the stairs. A lot of puppies I find, especially when they're young, are, if anyone has any country roots here, are kind of like cows, where they can go up the stairs, but going down is like a no-go. And this is frankly because going up and down stairs is just really scary. So I would start with find an area where you've got like 1 step and start there. Get your puppy to go up and down that 1 step, especially if you can find shallow steps too. And then see if you can work up to a couple more steps before you go down like a big long flight of stairs. And the other important thing is don't push your puppy, either physically or metaphorically speaking. Both of those you want to just go slow at their pace. And that's what I would start with. But that one I would not worry about for separation anxiety. That would be a separate question, really.
Okay, great. So for car anxiety, another great form of anxiety, I guess the question is, if a dog used to be okay in the car and now at about 5 months is shaking and whining and moving around, what would be kind of your steps to getting them used to being in the car again? Seems like they're anxious.
First step is I would go to the vet. The reason being because we're seeing a puppy who is okay with being in the car, and then we see a sudden behavioral shift. Anytime that you see a sudden behavioral change like that, one of the first stops you want to make is either setting up an appointment, or at the very, very least touching base and emailing your vet, because you don't know why that behavior changed. And to have a sudden behavior change is a classic example of something wrong with your dog, and this is the first sign. So for something like car anxiety, well, the first thing I would look at with the vet is whether or not my dog's developed car sickness. Because if your dog is car sick the entire time, well, then like no wonder that they don't like the car anymore. And they're like, no, make the vomit box go away, because I would also not like that. So the vet is the very first place that I would go. Beyond that, you really want to start with wherever they're comfortable. So this can mean something as simple as, will they happily load in and out of the car when it's off? Will they do it when it's on? What happens if you go out and you take a spin around the block and then come home? Is everything hunky-dory? At what point in time are things not hunky-dory anymore? Oh, interesting. We're not in the car for very long. He became not used to it. Oh, even walking to the car. Okay, then we gotta start there then. If we're experiencing things like extreme fear, like backing up, pulling away, shaking, anything along those lines, you really wanna go really, really slow. Bring lots of treats with you, and then you truly wanna go at your puppy's pace. You remember that you're not there to push your puppy from behind. You're there to stand on the sidelines and be a cheerleader for your puppy, so that when your puppy is ready to do that scary thing, walk one more step towards the car, you're there to be like, yay, new puppy. And then you give them some treats and be like, yay, look at that, you were brave and good stuff happened. Maybe you should be brave more often. And then they become braver and they're like, wow, look, nothing terrible has happened. And you really want to start there with any type of fear.
Yeah, does that make sense, Natalie? And Vivian, I guess.
Okay,
Yes.
very good.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, we are over time with all these amazing questions and answers. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming. As Holly said, there's a lot of depends answers. So if you guys feel like you have more questions, definitely stop by to the next Q&A, and Holly is doing virtual coaching as well as starting some in-person coaching soon. This kind of thing would be good to kind of start with a virtual session just so you can sit down and really talk and then meet in person later on. And yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel.
We're here.
Yeah, but have a great